Today I'm going to save you time if you're first starting out as a self-taught developer. Here's 7 things you should know before becoming one. My name's Ryan Sam. Let's get started. So my first thing on the list would be there's a difference between being a good programmer and a good interviewer. When I first got started, I focused on learning everything about technology that I could. Not only was I programming, but I also wanted to know about computer architecture, really just low level how a computer worked. So that took me in a route of learning C and C++ and diving really deep in those processes. After a couple months, I wanted to start learning how to use Linux and run my own web server, which was another thing that I spent a lot of time learning. I don't really regret any of these decisions that I make, but just know if you're trying to learn all these things all at once, it's really going to slow you down in the long run if you're trying to get a job. Optimally, you should be spending 70% of your time studying algorithms and data structures and 30% of your time really building a strong portfolio. In the meantime, you should be working on your LinkedIn profile and writing a strong resume about the projects that you've been working on. So the second thing on my list would be know your algorithms and data structures. About 4 months ago, I got my first on-site interview. I went in there and I felt like I was doing pretty well. Like a typical technical on-site interview, I was asked to do a whiteboarding question. It wasn't a very hard one. He wanted me to print out the numbers of the Fibonacci sequence. Now, this didn't take me too long to solve. In fact, I solved it correctly iteratively. But then my interviewer said, well, I was kind of thinking of a different solution. When he said that, I knew he was talking about the recursive solution. I didn't know recursion because I didn't study data structures and algorithms. I knew a little bit about Big O, and I could pretty much solve a lot of things using an iterative solution. When it came to writing code, implementing algorithms or data structures, I just couldn't do it. Now, I got to the end of the interview and I thought I did all right. I answered everything pretty much correctly with a couple mistakes, but when I went home after a couple weeks, I never heard from him. I later sent him a follow-up email to see what was going on. He replied to me and told me that I just wasn't right for the position. He didn't really give me much more than that. But you know what I bet it was? The fact that I couldn't solve that problem recursively. Had I have known how to do that, maybe I would have had a job there. To get started learning data structures and algorithms, I know of 3 sources that are really good. Number 1 would be LeetCode. LeetCode is a website that gives you interview problems that are close to what you would get on a real on-site interview. It has lots of problems ranging from easy, medium, and hard that can challenge pretty much any programmer. My second recommendation would be Cracking the Coding Interview. Cracking the Coding Interview is a book that teaches you about these data structures and algorithms and how to implement them. And then a little more than 100 pages in the book, it has lots of interview questions, and then towards the back of the book, it has hints as well as the answers to those questions. The third recommendation I would have is Elements of a Programming Interview. This is another book that's kind of similar to Cracking the Coding Interview that really dives deep in how to solve these hard technical problems. It also has lots of these algorithm problems for you to try out yourself as well. Now the fourth bit of advice is actually a video by CodeDrip. I'm going to link that up here. He actually has a whole video on how to get started on solving these problems. So the third thing on my list is recruiters, especially on LinkedIn, kind of really care about the years of experience that you have in the industry. Now, this could be different depending on where you live, but at least in my experience, that's what I've found in Houston. So on LinkedIn, all the time, I would get recruiters coming in my inbox, ask me if I was interested in a job, and I would say yes. This led to usually phone screenings with them, but it never took me to an on-site interview. Most of the time, it asked me questions about the projects that I've worked on, how many years I have in the industry, and I would always answer that, oh, well, I have 2 years of experience because I've been doing this for 2 years, and I have these projects. But then they would dive deeper and they'd say, have you actually had a job in the tech industry? And I'd tell them, well, no. And I don't know if maybe I was just saying the wrong thing, but in my experience, every time I've said that, it just never worked out for me. So I recommend if you're a self-taught developer that you don't really bother with recruiters on LinkedIn. I wouldn't say completely rule it out in the beginning, but if you find after a little while that's not really working with you, then you should really focus on other ways of getting a job. I always find this is a really bad metric for recruiters because when I first started learning, I was putting in 14 to 16 hours a day for 6 months straight. And I feel like the years of experience I had in programming didn't really correlate with how good I was at my skills. So my fourth tip on the list is you should focus on building projects with APIs. For portfolio projects, I find that APIs are really important because typically when you get hired as a developer, you're going to be working with APIs in a company all the time. Back-end engineers are going to be supplying data to the front end, and it's your job to take that data and and transform it into something that appears on the screen. If you have projects of this in your portfolio, it gives confidence in an employer that you'll be able to carry out some of the responsibilities as a front-end developer. When I first built my portfolio, I didn't have any projects that used an API, but when I built my first project using the Spotify API, that's how I got my first on-site interview. There's tons of APIs to choose from. I chose the Spotify API, but there's plenty of APIs provided by Google. There's also websites that just give you lists of APIs that you can work from. Really, the sky's the limit on this one. Just find something that you'd be interested working with and start having fun coding up a website. So my fifth thing on this list is you should look into the latest web development trends before you get started. When I first started learning programming, I already knew a little bit of HTML and CSS, but I really started strengthening those skills, and then I got into JavaScript. When I got into JavaScript, I was looking up tutorials on how to make drop-down menus and make things slide up and down and everywhere around the screen. But to do that, I was using a common library called jQuery. Now, jQuery has been a popular JavaScript library for a long time now. And the reason why I started really doubling down on jQuery is because of a book that I purchased. I can't really think of the title of the book off the top of my head, but I'll make sure to put a picture of them in the video. It wasn't that these books weren't any good. It's just I didn't really know what I was doing back then because I didn't really do a lot of research ahead of time. Had I have done my research, I would have found the two front-running libraries for JavaScript at the time were Angular and React. So after studying 6 months of JavaScript with jQuery, I thought I was ready to start applying for jobs. When I started looking at job descriptions, not really many of them included jQuery and the frameworks that they wanted you to know. Most of them, like I said, were React and Angular. So that set me back a couple months, and personally for me, I chose to learn React, which took quite some time that I would have saved if I would have started learning React from the beginning. Now, I'm not saying you have to learn React to get a job. I do recommend you check it out though, but you should pick a specialty. Whether it's be React, Angular, Vue, or any other libraries like that. Remember, the web is constantly changing, so what's popular today might not be popular tomorrow. You might wake up tomorrow morning, read some tweet about a popular JavaScript library that everyone's freaking out, it goes viral, and that suddenly becomes the new trend. If you want to hop on that trend, you'll be one of the first people applicable for a job requiring that skill. Also, if you find yourself going down the wrong path 6 months in like I did, don't feel discouraged. It's not the end of the world. Remember that you have been building your programming skills up to this point, which is a really important factor of becoming a good programmer. And when you start choosing another library, because you've already learned a previous library, learning a new library will go by a lot faster. In my case, it took me half the time to learn React that it did to take me to learn jQuery. So my sixth tip on the list is read. I cannot emphasize this enough. Read. What do I mean by that? Every time you're trying to learn a new language, anytime you're learning a new framework, anytime you're learning a new API, read, read, read. Now you might think this is super obvious, but I have 2 students that I teach, and a lot of times they don't read the documentation all the way through. They'll come to me and ask me questions on how to fix their project, and I'll point them to the documentation. I'll even give them the specific section in the documentation and tell them, read. After reading what I recommend to them, most of the time they're able to resolve the issue themselves. But really, it's really common today that when using a mobile device, our eyes tend to just scan the screen. Now this is usually fine if you're just weeding out information on Twitter and Facebook and stuff, because you know you don't really need to absorb all that information. But when you're reading documentation, it's very important that you read it more like a book. Now I know this might take a long time, but the more you do it, the more you'll start building a reference in your brain, and the faster you'll be able to recite documentation that you read earlier. Also remember to apply the skills that you learned. Give it a couple of tries. If it doesn't work out, come back to it tomorrow, read the documentation again, and give your next shot. I promise over time you will be able to figure out, and eventually that code will start working. Now my 7th tip and final tip is to be an expert at one language. This is really important in the beginning when you're first starting to learn. I know you're going to see all these kinds of tutorials on YouTube talking about how great Python is, how great Java is, how great some other crazy new programming language is. And I know these can be really exciting to kind of learn about. I kind of fell into that hole myself, but in the end, this isn't really the way you should go if you're trying to get the job in the quickest time. When you're first starting out, I recommend you pick one of the 4 languages: JavaScript, Python, Swift, or Java. JavaScript and Java are 2 different languages, by the way, if you don't know that. Now, JavaScript is for programming things on the web. If you have the Node.js runtime environment, you can start writing back-end code, but I really recommend that you also just focus on either the front end or the back end when you're first starting out. Python is really great for working with data. It's also a really good back-end language. It does have frameworks to do things on the front end, but it's more popularly used for back-end and AI. Swift is a new language that was released back in 2014 by Apple. Its main use is to build iOS apps, and it's a really great way to get started if you want to build apps on your iPhone or something like that. Java's been around for quite some time now. It's the main language to build applications on Android. It's also used in a lot of back-end code too. Now personally for me, I recommend JavaScript because it can do all 4 of those things I mentioned. JavaScript can be used for the front end, the back end, iOS apps, and Android apps. So it's really an all-around versatile language, and that's why it's one of my favorite languages that I use today. So that's going to be it for today, guys. Remember, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. This channel is going to be about business tech and creating a startup company. If you'd be interested in that, please subscribe. My name is Ryan Sam. Thank you guys for tuning in today, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. So that's going to be it for today, guys. Remember, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. So that's going to be it.